Okay, so our kickoff for the next thing that we're gonna do. This will be our actual, what we'll call design MVP round one, so minimum viable product. This is what I would like you to do. Well, one, you're gonna begin to edit your ideation and validate your favorite concepts. So validate basically mean you have a concept, we're gonna push it further and see if it's gonna work without making a masterpiece. One, review all the concepts that you've included in presentations thus far. I basically just mean the edits that you've already done, like the 10 from today, the 20 from last week. You don't have to go back and look at everything, though of course you could, because it's, from the insight sketches, it's 2 weeks later, you're 2 weeks different. Some of the stuff you rejected last time might actually seem suddenly viable. Find the strongest 10. How are we defining strongest? They're the ones that seem like they'll do the content justice, the ones that seem like they'll get people's attention, they don't require an artist statement to get them, and you'd be excited to work on it. From those 10, edit down to 5. Now, it might be really easy to edit down to 5 anyway, but I'm operating under the assumption that maybe the stuff you showed today, there's quite a bit that you liked, and of the 20 you showed before, there's quite a bit in there. And that kind of like when you're editing photography, if you have 300, first you get down to 250, then 200, then 175, and you just kind of keep whittling down. So if you have potentially 30 concepts, I would try to get down to 10, and then from there, edit down to 5. My first suggestion is going to be to kill anything that requires an unreasonable amount of formal investigation to pull off a technique, say more than 3 hours, or that requires you to venture into the technological unknown. So now is not the time to learn studio lighting for elaborate photo shoots. Think about it this way: would you hire a photographer for your project that had no idea how to achieve the results that you wanted? I am such an anti-advocate of learning on the project, because the project suffers while you learn how to do a thing that potentially is not nearly as good as the vision you had for the thing. So like I've had this happen a lot where people want to do photo stuff, but they don't have the background or the resources to pull it off. So then they just have mediocre photos in the thing, and there's not the time to become an awesome photographer. So that to me is a really easy way, once you're at 10, to get yourself down to 5. Because right off the bat you go, requires an elaborate photo shoot, and I don't have that skill set. If this is something that's important to me, I should start doing it on little projects outside of big major projects, so that I can build up that skill set the same way a photographer would go through a number of photography classes or small projects before they took on a big elaborate photo project. I'm kind of asking you, treat yourself the same as you would treat an outside vendor. So your 3D type, let's say you wanted to do 3D renderings and you don't have the skill set, you would never find a random person who doesn't know how to make 3D type and be like, can I pay you to do 3D type for my poster? It doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny, but then we do that to ourselves in projects, and all that happens is 90% of the time, we don't get to where we need to be, and we've spent so much time on this thing that we're struggling to learn how to do in a high pressure environment, that all those weeks that you're supposed to have finishing this project, doing merch and tickets and environmental graphics, it's all eaten up by trying to figure out how to make the 3D type for the poster. It's supposed to be like this awesome thing that we get to make. It's not supposed to be like this multi-week long struggle. I'm gonna back up a little bit and say, one of the things that you can do is, in any of the things that you have, I would say you have a lot of options for how you might execute something. So if I'm thinking about another example, let's say the portraits with the quotes. So we know that like the sketch we saw, it's like a framed portrait and there's a quote kind of potentially plastered right on top of it. But the number of ways that we could execute that. You could find an actual portrait, find stock photography of a gilded frame, find a background of like wallpaper, and you could make like a Photoshop comp, and then you could either Photoshop the quote in so that it sat directly in the image, or you could have it on a surface layer above. It's very kind of vectory, right? But another option is print out that same portrait, get a frame, put it on a wall, and photograph it. Another option is make a weird drawing of that scene. Like, there's this pile of things that you can do for 90% of what anyone has shown today. Very few people showed something that only works in one specific execution. And I think one of the things that's cool about seeing them in pencil drawings is you start to go, I wonder if that just could be a drawing. That would be kind of cool and unexpected. So if you have a concept and your first thing is like, oh, well, he said, don't do a crazy studio lighting thing if I've never done a crazy studio lighting thing, do a quick brainstorm on what's all the ways you could do that concept before you kill it. Because maybe there's something in the big Venn diagram of stuff I know how to do and ways to do this project, there's an alternative that's still compelling. Does that make sense to everybody? So you don't have to dismiss anything out of hand. I just want you to be realistic, because ultimately you have to get results quickly in order to do all the other stuff later in the semester that we want to do. Is that everybody on board with that? That's one of the beauties of doing a lot of stuff, that you can just get rid of something, you just kind of slough it off and be like, oh, it would be cool, but I can't do it. So get down to 5. For those 5 concepts, produce a digital MVP of a poster or a poster series. I have an asterisk here. The reason that I want you to do digital is because the gap between a sketch and the execution might be beyond your reach, and a layout may be better proof of concept. Depending on your drawing skills, depending on the level of experience you have with designing stuff, sometimes you make a sketch and in your mind, oh yeah, I can do this. And then again, when you start doing it, it turns out to be this like bigger struggle, or it doesn't come together the way you think it's going to. So I think keep the MVP, this like kind of rough design, keep it an actual layout, so that it's closing the gap between what you want to do and what you're capable of. And if you need to do a tighter pencil sketch to kind of figure it out more, and then move into like a rough Illustrator, Photoshop, InDesign comp, whatever you work best in. And we'll come back to this in a second. So for those 5 concepts, should include festival title, subtitle if necessary, movies if necessary, probably necessary, dates if necessary, a URL or a call to action, no lorem ipsum, no lorem ipsum, no lorem ipsum, no lorem ipsum. Absolutely no lorem ipsum. So the reason I'm saying all that stuff is if necessary, because one, maybe the name of your film festival takes care of needing a subtitle. Maybe you're using imagery in some way where you feel like you don't even need to see the film titles. The other thing is, just because you have to include them doesn't mean they can't be like that that sort of cop-out thing that like happens on indie rock posters, where there's the band's name and it's like a big graphic thing, and then the opening bands and all the other information is that line of condensed all cap sans serif type along the bottom, because the person who designed it is a terrible typographer, so they can hide it by just like making it small. So the film festival movies do not have to be gigantic and take up a lot of real estate. They certainly can, and I will love it because I like big giant type, but you don't have to do that. Try to distribute your time evenly between the concepts. If you don't like one, don't work on it for hours thinking that it will change. As soon as you have the feeling of, I'm not sure how I feel about this, that's a good time to cut your losses, and go, back into your list of 10 and be like, number 6 is gonna come into play now. So remember, these should be rough. They're real content, but in a rough form. The reason we want the real content, let's say, and because people do this all the time, they have this concept and they work super hard on whatever's the image-based part of it. And they finish that, and then they bring in everything else, and it's this complete mess. Because like the information, the other stuff that needs to be there didn't have room to breathe, because the person wasn't making a poster, they were making an illustration, and now suddenly they have to jam the stuff in. So that's not to say that you can't go outside of InDesign or whatever and make an illustration. It's just to say, if you're only gonna spend 2 hours a piece on these, don't spend an hour and 45 minutes on the image and then 15 minutes being frustrated that the type doesn't fit. You gotta work in the way that makes sense to you, so you might have to dump the type to the side and then bring it back in, I get that, but the biggest thing is like, just don't sink all your time into making an illustration only to find out that like you've left no room for anything else, and maybe now you're super attached to the way the illustration works and you kind of don't want to bring other stuff in, which is like a thing that people do. So don't do that. So for next Wednesday then, it's 5 rough layouts of a poster or a poster series. And basically rough means like, if you're thinking about pink, you do not necessarily need to go consult a Pantone book, just get it in roughly the neighborhood. Don't buy fonts, for example. Just find something, like if you're like, you have it in your mind an image of like a hyper condensed font, but to do that you have to buy one. Just find something to use as like a placeholder that's roughly in the right neighborhood, and then get it right later if that's the one that you want and if it's worth the $35 to buy a font for it. Does that make sense? So really just be like, you just want to get enough that you're like, the idea's there, we can have a talk about it. We're not gonna look at next week and then be like, oh, the kerning on this one. Like it's not the goal of the conversation. It's just to see a more tightened up version of some of these sketches. Because to me, what will happen is just in doing that, some of them become less interesting to you. And it naturally kind of will edit itself. By the time you show stuff on Wednesday, you're probably gonna be like, oh, I like this one. Done, end of story. If you don't, that's cool too, and then you gotta pick one and it's hard and blah, blah, blah. But I would kind of hope that you could get a workable version of each in 1 to 2 hours. And I'm gonna introduce another step that might help with that. As you get the 5 that you're gonna run with, if you're not entirely sure about the kind of what those visuals should look like in terms of type styles, then go and do additional visual research of like, what kind of type do you think it should look like? Essentially, grabbing bits and pieces of stuff to sort of think these things through. I think that this is really smart when you're early on, because it forces you to look at more design. And a lot of times what people do is like when they pull, like say a mood board, they are looking at the big picture kind of graphic quality of it. Like, oh, that's what the headlines will look like. No one ever really pulls kind of mood imagery to be like, what should the stuff in the bottom left corner look like? And that's why, I don't know, in sort of mediocre programs, you'll see all this work like it's posters where the big thing is awesome and the rest of it is 12-point Helvetica, because like there's no references for what to do after the big gesture. I think it's really smart to look at references of like, oh, maybe the big stuff works like this, but then looking at lots of stuff to be like, well, what might this look like? Or if I think it should be in a box, like you could have a mood board of just boxes to hold type. And to me, that's a smart move. Let's say you're gonna put some information in a little box somewhere. instead of just drawing a box and putting the type in it, or thinking like, oh, well, I could do this or this, you could just go and look at a whole bunch of editorial design, or you could even just go to like the magazine section of somewhere and look through that front part of the magazines with all like the crazy infographic type shit, and just take photos of different techniques for making boxes, so that suddenly you've now expanded your understanding of what's possible. Because typically you do that by doing lots of stuff. The other way you can do it is by doing like an audit of how to potentially handle something, and then basically that makes you better. And the way that it makes you better is you now have more references, you have a better understanding of what's possible or what's doable, and then instead of doing the entry level kind of student thing, you're suddenly like realizing, oh, that's an interesting technique. Like, what if it's this thing and then inside it is this and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, if you wanted something that looked technical, you would look at more stuff. Does that make sense to people? There's a concept I really like from the movie Gerhard Richter Painting. And I feel like I talk about this all the time, but if I haven't in a while, good. He's in his office and he's got this little desk with a phone, and on the wall is like a bunch of images. And it's like a postcard for a Picasso show that he scanned in and then flipped because he wanted to see how it worked. There's like a Courbet painting, a little black and white reproduction. There's like a random piece of photojournalism from World War II. All these like images, and they're unrelated to each other. And then there's a few of his smaller pieces, and he says that they're his storehouse of treasures. Like, they're all the things that they're what art should do, and he has them up to try to understand them. And then he has his own stuff next to them, because he's trying to figure out if his stuff that he's made recently is any good. So he puts it next to like the absolute best stuff that he knows of, and just lets it live there for a month with the idea that, does it deserve to be here or not? And I think there's a corollary to that, which is that you can get past a lot of the entry-level student stuff by looking at a lot of stuff, just in general. But then the other thing that you can do is just build into the process an aspect of looking at things that's not the normal, like, ripping shit off mood board thing, but instead to be like, well, I know I want to do, I'm interested in frames. I'm just gonna look at as many examples of like text boxes as possible. And that sounds silly, but then all of a sudden, like, you're not doing the expected thing, or you're not doing the thing that you know how to do. You might be doing something that's more advanced. So I think like some stuff you'll know what to do right away and you'll know what you want to do, but I think it's a really good way to expand your horizons to do that kind of visual research of like, if you know that you're interested in like a kind of sans serif title treatment, just pull a shitload of examples, kind of the same process, pull a whole bunch of stuff, then get rid of a bunch of it, see like what's left there, and then be like, well, that's kind of an interesting technique. And again, it's like the genre, I'm not saying obviously like look at something and then do exactly that thing, but just like use it as a way to expand your references for what's possible. Does that make sense? So that to me is like an intermediary step. Like, you might do that specific to each concept, so the amount of research you might do could be radically different from piece to piece, right? Like, one of them might involve a ton of looking at stuff, and another one just might be like, I wonder what museum placards actually look like, because maybe you think they look one way, and then you kind of realize, like, you go out in the world and like, oh no, they don't look like what I thought they look like.